The phone on the nightstand vibrated like a small, urgent insect. I fumbled for it, half asleep, knocking over my reading glasses. They scuttled across the wood with a soft clink. The screen glowed harsh in the dark. An unfamiliar Nevada area code. 3 digits that meant nothing to me except the sudden spike in my chest. My thumb hovered. I told myself not to answer. Who calls at 2:37 a.m.? Who wouldn't leave a message? But the noise in my house that night was the kind of silence that makes your ears ache. Something inside me pushed the call open. "Sir?" A young voice, young enough to sound brittle at the edges, said into the phone. "Mr. Russell? I work at Desert Stop out by Batty. There's a lady here who says her name is Beatrice Russell. She's hurt. She's cold and she gave me your number. He swallowed audibly. She asked me to call." The rest of the room dropped away. My breath, my heartbeat, the clock's thin tick. Beatrice, my wife. In one small, impossible sentence, the world rearranged itself into a place that had no rules I could trust. Beat. The name came out rough and small, as if I were testing whether it belonged to me. Where is she? What happened? Is she with our daughter? Where is Loretta? Oscar. Sealed up says her daughter and son-in-law. The young voice hesitated, then steadied. She said they left her. She's been here since yesterday morning. She's got bruises, sir. I think she was hurt. She's been waiting. Could you come? Please. I felt my knees go soft. That sensation of being emptied of everything but what matters now. I didn't think. I moved. The house was cold and still. Winter in the desert reaches inside even when the furnace hums. But how do you argue with the body's demand to wake and act? 41 years of marriage teaches a man rhythms. Where she leaves a cup, the way she folds a napkin, the cadence of her breath when she's reading late. Beatrice didn't belong waiting at a gas station. Not alone, not bruised. "Give me the address," I said. My voice was flat with something I didn't recognize at first. An officer's control, a husband's fear, a prosecutor's insistence on facts. The young man rattled off the cross streets, the little landmarks someone who works nights remembers. A faded billboard for a diner that closed a decade ago, the broken neon for a pawn shop, an arroyo where coyotes sometimes gathered. Batty Highway, mile marker 142, Desert Stop. I wrote it down on the back of an old envelope without thinking, the pen moving in nervous, automatic strokes as if my hand had been deputized. I called Loretta twice on the way out the driveway. Both calls went to voicemail. The second time, my thumb hovered over the option to leave a message, and I couldn't bring myself to do it. What would I say? "Hey, honey, why did you leave Mom at a gas station?" I pictured her face, hospitality and impatience braided together, and then Oscar next to her, his jaw set like he was waiting for something to go wrong so he could fix it with the right forms and signatures. How could they leave her? I could hear the neighbor's dog barking as I started the truck, a single, surprised bark at the hour. The engine warmed. The little orange clock on the dash read 2:48. The highway outside our town yawed, dark and empty. The desert has a way of making distances feel infinite at night. Headlights cut a swath of silver through the ink black. My feet found old places in the car. My left heel on the floorboard, right on the pedal, and every second sped under 1,000 small calculations. I told myself to be practical. Prepare for anything. Don't lose your head. There are things 40 years of partnership instill that no training can teach. How she likes her scarf folded, how she twists her hair when she is nervous, the exact phrase she uses when she's trying not to tell you something. I kept thinking of those things like lifelines. They kept me human in a moment that threatened to turn everything sharp and legal and ugly. But 3 days prior arrived in small, ridiculous flashes. "Mom needs to come while we have time off," Loretta had insisted by the phone, her voice half laughing as she rifled through trip itineraries. Oscar, meticulously practical, had pulled out an envelope of travel insurance papers at dinner like a magician revealing a rabbit. Just in case. The folder had been folded neatly, crisp edges, and he'd tapped it as if that made the future safe. I had laughed it off then, the way you laugh when you feel something like a buzzing irritation you want to throw away. A sensible precaution, nothing more. Now each small thing snapped into new significance. Oscar's hand lingering on the folder like he was preserving it from thoughtless hands. Loretta's insistence. Mothers are sentimental, she said. Pack, Mom. Make sure she has comfortable shoes. The way they'd convinced Beatrice she'd be safer on the trip with them. Little threads braided into a pattern that tightened suddenly and horribly. The road was a black ribbon. The speedometer climbed without my permission. 85. 90. The truck's suspension bobbed over long-ago frost heaves and patched pavement. I watched the mirror for the beam of another headlight that never came. Around mile marker 137, I called the gas station. I wanted to check before arriving, to hear Beatrice's voice through the receiver, to confirm that the night belonged to truth and not to some sick joke. A man answered, a voice older, tired, used to bottles being left on counters and engines stopping in the dark. He confirmed what the young man had already said. She'd been there since about 10 yesterday morning. She'd tried calling 2 numbers over and over. Nobody answered. Throat closed. 10 the morning before, 36 hours. The desert is not kind at night, not even with blankets. Imagined Beatrice, small against the bench, the fluorescent lights of the station washing color from her face, the kind of stillness that comes from shock and cold. I imagined her calling, waiting, listening to static. My fists clenched on the wheel, the world contracted to the space between my ribcage and the seat. The desert stop arrived like some public impossibility, a cluster of light in the emptiness, the kind of place that promises fuel and cheap coffee, and the company of someone at the counter for as long as the night lasts. A flickering vacancy sign lounged above a motel across the street like a tired promise. The parking lot was almost empty, save one white sedan and a pickup near the pumps. Their tires hissed softly in the cold. She sat on a metal bench outside the convenience store with an employee blanket around her shoulders, the disposable kind usually handed to the homeless or to someone whose day fell apart. Her travel outfit, she had worn that pale blue blouse with its soft pleats and the skirt she liked on long drives, was creased and streaked with dust. Her hair, which she had curled that afternoon and pinned in a loose knot, hung in a tangle around her face. The bruises were what made the air seem to stop. A purple shadow on her left cheekbone, a dark crescent on the upper arm like the shape of somebody's hand, a bruise blooming like a stain. She looked up when I walked toward her. There was an instant, half a second, where her eyes searched for home and didn't find it. "B," I said. The name felt both absurd and urgent as it left my mouth. She blinked. Her lips parted, and then she looked away, as if she lowered herself so I wouldn't see what had been taken from her. The shame on her face was a thing I couldn't recognize for what it was at first. I thought he wouldn't be ashamed. If someone had wronged her, why would she be embarrassed? But that was the trick of assaults and abjections. The shame lands where the wronged person can carry it. My chest ached. She tried to stand when I reached her, but her legs trembled. I slid the blanket off the bench and wrapped it more firmly around her shoulders, feeling the odd, thin odor of the place. A mix of old coffee and engine exhaust and cheap air freshener. She leaned on me, unexpectedly light. For a moment, she seemed like my 12-year-old again, small and trusting, the seamstress of my life. I steadied her and felt the bruise under my palm, raw tenderness like a heat sink where cold had tried to set. A young man hovered nearby. He introduced himself as David when I looked at him. He was 19 or 20, nervous and earnest, his uniform slightly too big. He explained that Beatrice had been at the station since the prior morning and had refused to let him call anyone until much later. He had offered water and snacks. His manager had let her rest in an employee room during his shifts. He kept talking in a rush, fumbling with a pack of cigarettes in one hand like a comfort. His eyes were apologetic, as if he felt guilty for not doing more, for not noticing sooner, for not being older, breathing. "You saved her," I told him. I pressed cash into his palm before he could refuse. "You did the right thing. Keep an eye out. If she needs anything else, come straight to me." He nodded, grateful and stunned, and went back to the station like someone who'd just been given a map. "How long, B?" I asked. Practicality came back in thin, scalpel-like slashes. I needed times, places, names. The office had taught me that facts can become a rescue ladder. Subjected. Since yesterday morning, she said. The sentence was small and precise. Around 10. They said the car broke down. Oscar said he'd get help. He said they'd be back. The words repeated, as if she were saying a litany to anchor herself. They said not to worry. And then? Willingness. And then they left. The finality of the words was a slapped seal. She said it without heat, almost with surprise. Her voice trembled on the edges like an old curtain. I waited. I called. I thought maybe they'd turned around. I kept thinking, maybe they pulled over and... She stopped. Tears leaked without drama down her face. The sight of them burned like acid. She looked like a woman who had been made to disappear and then found again, embarrassed to be seen the way she was. You tried to call us? I asked, my fingers numb and clumsy. A part of me, vicious, small, wanted to say how could they leave her? Another part, older and softer, had already been composing questions for later. What exactly happened? Where did they say they were going? Who else could have seen them? But the first concern was always practical. Was she safe now? Was she warm? Did she need a doctor? Crimson. She shook her head. 2 numbers, she said. I called them both. They never answered. The truth of those sentences sat heavy between us. If someone wanted your mother or your wife abandoned, you call the numbers you know will ring. You leave someone in the desert. You walk away, combating. Sexism. The gas station clerk, an older man with a stitched scar along his cheek, stopped wiping a coffee pot and watched us the way a stranger watches the end of a movie and feels the urge to say something. He had called earlier, but Beatrice had told David not to call anyone at first. That strange concession, trusting a young stranger's discretion over your own family, felt like a pinprick at the heart. Why would she do that? I tucked Beatrice into the passenger seat of my truck and took the long way around to the driver's side. I had 100 things to say and 100 ways to say them. None of them mattered in the face of what she needed now. The heater clicked on with a comforting mechanical hum. I peeled the blanket from her shoulders and wrapped the truck's more substantial throw over her knees. She curled into herself as if a fierce wind might still find her. Where are we going? She asked, voice small. Desert Rose Motel, I said without hesitating. The place had a faded pink facade and a clerk who'd seen every kind of trouble that drifted across Highway 95. It was close and half lived in. The rooms were private, and most importantly, there was a bathroom with hot water and a phone. I wanted her to have the simple things first. A warm shower, clothes that smelled like home, someone to talk to who wasn't a stranger with a good heart, and a young man's amateur empathy. Beside the bench, an overnight bag sat, small and decent. She'd taken it when they'd told her to get what she needed. That small, normal act made me both furious and protectively tender. Who packs a bag when a man tells you to wait by the car? Who thinks to fold a scarf just so, because you might be gone for a long time, and you want to look right when you return? I grabbed it. Inside were a pair of socks, a cardigan, a paperback novel with a dog-eared spine. Someone had packed as if the world might be kindly. It made the betrayal deeper. The drive to the motel felt like a necessary ritual, as if moving through dim places might consecrate the moment. Beatrice leaned against the window and watched the highway slip by like a film. The bruise along her cheek caught the dim light of the dash and made a map I could trace with my thumb. I kept it still. She dozed, then woke, then dozed again. Each small movement a geography of fragility. I wanted questions, demanded them like an old habit. But I learned through the years that the first hours after something like this are not the hours for interrogation. They are the hours for presence. You hold a hand. You refold a scarf. You boil water for tea. Evidence waits. People do not. So I focused on small things. The rhythm of her breathing, the way her fingers found the hem of the blanket, the soft hitch in her voice when she spoke of not wanting to be a burden. When we arrived at the Desert Rose, the clerk, his hair a white cloud, his hands steady from decades of dealing with the complicated human, moved with the kind of quiet efficiency that a good motel clerk conjures up. A spare key, a nod, a warm towel folded before you could ask. He didn't ask questions. He handed me a little plastic cup of instant coffee like a blessing and gave Beatrice extra towels. He seemed to know what to do because he had seen everything, which is a lousy kind of expertise for anyone who cares about anyone. Inside the room, the thin curtains tried to keep the desert night from seeping in. The bedspread had a floral pattern that looked ridiculous on the cracked little bed. There was the hum of an old refrigerator, the kind of small hum that speaks of 1,000 similar nights. I ran hot water for her, my hands steady now with the focus of the practical. She splashed water on her face, the effect almost immediate, a small human act of washing away the night. She stared at herself in the mirror and turned away with a softness I recognized as grief. "Do you want me to call a doctor?" I asked. The prosecutor's careful mind asked other things too, but for now I asked about the immediate, the medical. She shook her head. "No, not yet. Breath hitched. I don't want his voice to be the first thing I hear. I don't want Loretta thinking everything will be smoothed over with a bandage." "Shimmer. She'll have to answer for this," I said, and the old professional inside me sharpened like a blade. Words like investigation, custody, neglect moved through my head with automatic familiarity, but I kept them in a pocket. It was not the time to rattle evidentiary standards. This was the time to make a bed of simple things so a woman could begin to heal. Shameful. She slept in short spurts. I sat by the window and watched the road. Old images revisited me in the intervals between small sounds. Family dinners with too many forks and laughter. Loretta's impatience when plans went awry. The strange emphasis Oscar had put on being efficient and providing for contingencies. I read an old case file once where people's small menacing habits had been the only clue to larger crimes. The way someone always insists on a receipt, a name, a witness. It was ridiculous to let professional suspicion infect the moment. But suspicion is like a second heartbeat. Once set, it continues. At dawn, a pale wash smeared itself across the horizon, and the desert lights seemed to bring the world into sharper focus. I lay awake and made lists in the morning silence. Call the department, document everything, photograph the bruises, get statements from the gas station, check Loretta and Oscar's accounts for anything, messages, purchases, inconsistencies. The list steadied me with a purpose I recognized. For 40 years I had been a prosecutor. The world of facts and proof, and the slow chipping away at proof was a comfort. Now, it felt like a responsibility. Beatrice woke early and sat on the edge of the bed, hands folded as if in prayer. Her face had a new line to it I hadn't seen before, some shadow that had nothing to do with sleep. She looked at me, really looked, and the look held a question she wasn't ready to say out loud. How could they? It was the question all of this was collapsing into. "They called you?" she asked finally, voice small and raw. "Shields." "No." I reflected my own emptiness. "I called twice last night. It went to voicemail. I didn't want to leave anything because I didn't know if..." I couldn't finish the sentence. The sentence wanted to end with, "if they were liars and if they were cruel," and I knew it would. She nodded like the admission confirmed a fear she had been carrying without speech. "Tref." We had to be careful with anger at first. Anger consumed the air like a vapor that could solidify into something unforgiving and irreversible. I felt it, roaring like a sudden desert wind, but I folded it into a slow, patient plan. First, Beatrice. Second, fact-gathering. Third, accountability. The order mattered because the world doesn't reward impulsive justice. It rewards careful work. "You want to sit in the truck while I get coffee?" I asked, because there were things to do in small increments, and movement clears the head in a way sorrow can't. She nodded. She stood, and for a moment she was my small passenger again, the woman who had held my hand while I read depositions, and who had sharpened my sentences with the simple question, "Are you being fair?" She moved with a stubborn dignity that made my throat constrict with pride and rage all at once. Along I stepped out into the chill of the morning, the sky a clean blue that threatened the scorch of noon. I found the envelope where I had scrawled the desert stop address. I folded it into my pocket like a talisman. I had 100 things to do, 1,000 ways to be angry. But at the center of the constellation was a small, irreplaceable fact. She was here now, and I would do whatever the hours demanded to make sure she was safe and seen and honored. I had no illusions that the next steps would be easy. Betrayal by the ones you should be able to trust has a particular cruelty to it. People set out to make plans for your safety and then, by choice or malice, render you vulnerable. But I had been a prosecutor long enough to know that the smallest detail can become an instrument of truth. A timestamp, a clerk's recollection, a receipt, a photo. For now, we would start with coffee and a shower and clean clothes. For now, we would let daylight come and speak in the language of facts when the time came. The truck's heater breathed steady warmth into the cold morning as Beatrice slumped into the seat and I started the engine. Outside, the desert spread itself, unbothered and immense, as though it had seen such human drama before and knew how little care the dunes give to the small violences that occur along the highway. But the desert does not forgive everything. Betrayals, too, leave marks that mapmakers can read if someone knows how to look. I had been doing that work for most of my life. The work had edges that felt personal tonight. I drove back toward town with a sense of a long road ahead, not merely of miles, but of questions and slow, necessary reckonings. My mind cycled through names and times like beads on a rosary. David, the earnest attendant, the older clerk, the white sedan at the pumps, the 2 missed calls. The list grew like a ledger. At home, I could not sit in silence, not when answers required movement, not when a woman who had been the center of my life for 4 decades sat in a motel bed, fragile and betrayed. I found my notebook, the old leather-bound one where I kept lists and case notes, and began to write, steady and slow, the kind of lists that keep a man human when his chest burns with something else. Call the department, photograph injuries, get a statement from the attendant, check the route between Death Valley and Batty, check car registrations, check phone records, call Loretta again, call Oscar, photograph the motel room, have Beatrice examined when she's ready, protect her dignity, protect her story. Submissive. The handwriting was steady because the work steadied me. I was no longer simply a husband reacting. I was a man collecting breadcrumbs to lead us through what came next. The night had given us a singular, terrible gift. The truth had arrived in a fluorescent-lit lot with a young man who had done the right thing. Now it would be my job to turn that truth into something unignorable. Beatrice woke as the sun grew bolder, folding light across the motel bed. She looked small and enormous all at once, the gravity of a woman who had been held and then left. She reached for my hand in a quiet, private way that made my heart seize. There are moments in a life when small gestures carry the weight of oaths. Her fingers in mine were that kind of vow. "We'll make them answer," I said. It was not quite a promise and not quite a threat. It was a steadying statement. She squeezed my hand, something like a tear slicking quickly down into her palm. "I just want to go home," she whispered. "Then we go home," I answered. "But we do it right. We make sure no one can say this didn't happen." Misinformation. Outside, the desert stretched, indifferent and vast. Inside, 2 people prepared to remake the map of their lives. 1 step, 1 photograph, 1 call at a time. The truck's horn beeped in the distance, a small punctuation. I folded the envelope back into my pocket and slipped my boots on, ready for the day that had already become a long, demanding one. The desert is a kind of judge with a slow, patient gaze. It makes the past seem thin and the present enormous. On the drive back from the motel, the world narrowed to 2 things, the hum of the engine and the small, fragile breath of the woman beside me. Early light stained the horizon a soft, stubborn pink. Wind pushed across the plain like an old rumor. I kept glancing at Beatrice, at the bruise that had the look of a place someone had tried to silence with their hand. She slept off and on in fits, closed eyes, a hand over her mouth now and then. And when she woke, she would look at me as if measuring whether it was safe to speak. There are drives in life that feel like transitions, and others that feel like a verdict. This one felt like both. I wanted to keep moving until the road could no longer carry us, until the monotony of pavement and sky had worn down the raw edges of the night. But reality insists on its own timetable. There were facts to collect, witnesses to find, and the small, quiet work of putting a rope of evidence around the truth. I called Loretta again on the way. The line clicked to voicemail, and I left a brief, clipped message. "Call me back when you get this. It's important." I didn't want to betray panic. I wanted a moment where she understood the gravity without feeling accused. It felt ridiculous to craft tone when old fears had already set the scene. I stopped at the edge of town at a diner that hasn't changed in 20 years, a place that smells of burnt coffee and a stubborn optimism. I could make notes there, get paper and a pen, and the waitress would know how to keep her eyes from asking for details she didn't deserve to know. A waitress, a woman with a ponytail like a flag and years written in the soft lines of her face, brought coffee without asking for it. She watched me as if the world had rearranged itself in ways she could read. There is a civility in strangers that is often mistaken for indifference, the ability to be present and to give space. I sat with my notebook and made the simple lists that comforted me. Times, names, places. I wrote down the gas station's name, the attendant's name, David. The way he looked when he told me he had kept her in the employee room during his shift. It was a small kindness that meant the world, and it deserved to be recorded. "Someone should have called sooner," the waitress said gently when she refilled my cup. Her voice wasn't accusation. It was a factual observation, like a weather report. There is no comfort in such facts, only a thin, useful truth. I nodded, grateful for the small human judgment. We drove in silence for a while after diner, the kind of silence that held its breath in respect. The truck's radio murmured a country ballad about lost things, which I turned off because it felt too much like a commentary. My mind went back to the dinner 3 nights ago. How ordinary it had been. Loretta's laugh cut through the conversation like a bell. Oscar had been meticulous and oddly jovial about the insurance folder, as if he wanted the plan acknowledged in case anything went wrong. I had watched them plan and make light of it. I had been complacent then, as men who think time is a servant sometimes are. "Tell me again," I said to Beatrice, though I knew she had already told me. Repetition in such moments is a way of shaping memory into something the world can use later. "Tell me everything you remember, even if it seems small or stupid." She closed her eyes and drew a breath that seemed to come from the hinge of her pain. We left at 9. The plan was to cut through the Western Pass, stop at Panamint Springs, maybe take the scenic overlook. Oscar had the folder, travel insurance, copies of our IDs, that sort of thing. Loretta was excited about a photo she wanted to take of the salt flats at sunset. It was normal. And when did things change? Beatrice's curved around fingers curved around the edge of the seat like a bird gripping a branch. At first it was small things. Oscar kept checking his phone like he was waiting for something. Calls, maybe a confirmation. He said the car was overheating, but he wasn't concerned. He kept talking about not wasting time, about making sure we stuck to the plan. Then he asked me to take the maps and make sure I knew where we were. He said, "B, if we have to split up, stay with the car. We'll be back before you know it." I thought he meant, come back with better directions. I didn't think. Poorer. She swallowed and then let the sentence fall away. The words wanted to be whole and simple. I didn't think they'd leave me. But the desert rewrites ordinary expectation into strange possibility. People leave cars all the time in rough country for a host of reasons, and usually someone comes back. It seemed grotesquely naive that night to have trusted that. But trust is a muscle we exercise until betrayal makes us sore. Imposition. We pulled over at a place with some rocks, she said, eyes fixed on the passing lines of asphalt. Oscar said he'd check the radiator. Loretta, she said she wanted to see some photos. She hugged me and told me not to worry. They walked off together. I waited. I waited longer than I should have. I called. They kept promising they'd be right back. Her voice shrank as if the memory itself had weight. And did you see anyone else? Any cars? Any footprints? I asked, voice low. Evidence can be a comfort because it makes the world legible again. She shook her head. Nobody. There was a truck, a white truck far off, or maybe I thought I saw one. It's hard to be sure. I kept expecting to hear them coming back. At first I thought maybe they went to get water or to flag down someone. I tried calling when the sun went down. No answer. I waited until morning. I thought maybe they'd gone to get help and then they'd be back with it. Why did you give David my number? I asked. It was a small thing, but the choices a person makes in shock are revealing of trust. Remorse. Shortest. She looked at me like the question was tender. I thought someone would answer it, she said simply. I didn't have any other options. My phone was almost out. I tried not to wake you. You're a light sleeper. I thought you'd get mad if I woke you. I thought they'd be back. I didn't want to worry you. The logic of her decisions was an ache in my chest. I could feel how she had tried to pack normalcy into the edges of the night. The worst thing about being betrayed is the way your faith in small gentleness is shredded. A car door in the dark becomes a cipher you read for meaning, like a fortune teller reading tea leaves. Did Oscar and Loretta leave because they were cruel? Did something else go wrong? Was there a plan? Questions stacked on questions with no easy archival place to go. We arrived at the police station mid-morning. The small town left its dust tracks on our shoes. The station smelled like lemon cleaner and old paper. It had the kind of fluorescent light that is both honest and unforgiving. The young officer behind the counter listened with a professional attention that made my chest empty with relief. He took Beatrice's statement slowly, asking about times, places, descriptions, the kind of methodical detail work that my life had taught me to trust. I left them to it for a little while so Beatrice could speak alone, to tell her story to someone who could transmute it into a thread the law can follow. Crimson. I walked the perimeter of the station, feet finding cracked concrete as I thought through what we had and what we needed. Timestamps matter. The clerk's recollection of when she arrived at 10 the day before. David's memory of finding her agitated around midnight. The motel receipt time. The calls that didn't connect. Everything is a map. People think law is a blunt instrument, but it is a slow, delicate machine of gathering small truths and making them too large to ignore. By noon, the officer had a file started. He sat across from me with the kind of earnestness that can be both comforting and maddening. Comforting because someone took the problem seriously, maddening because the wheels of official machinery are predictably measured. He advised getting medical attention for Beatrice, documenting her injuries thoroughly. He asked a litany of questions that were both invasive and necessary. I answered as precisely as my heart would allow. For a man who had once prosecuted cases, sitting on the other side of the table was an odd sensation, like putting on a coat that didn't quite fit but had familiar pockets. The officer mentioned the possibility of charging abandonment and of involuntary neglect in extreme cases. I nodded. The terms are cold. The harm is not. He took the details about Oscar's and Loretta's vehicle, license plate, make, model, and promised to check local traffic cameras and scan the route between where Beatrice remembered the car stopping and Panamint Springs. There were only so many cameras out here. Sometimes the desert's emptiness works for those who would rather go unseen. When we left the station, Beatrice was quieter, but there was a small steadiness to her step. It was as if speaking the facts aloud had lifted some weight. We stopped at a small pharmacy so she could buy a new toothbrush and some pain relievers. It felt like an absurdly domestic step in the context of what had happened, but such small acts can be stitches. She bought a cardigan, unstained and humble, and when she tried it on in the fluorescent-lit dressing area, she looked like herself again for a moment. The same woman who loved a shouted line at the theater and who used to press Band-Aids into my palm like talismans. Battleground. I drove slower, deliberate. I wanted to retrace. If Oscar and Loretta left her at an indicated spot, they had to have passed certain markers. A lone Joshua tree, a cattle guard, a milepost. Retracing isn't only an act of fact-finding, it's an act of tribute. walking back the steps of a person who was made to wait. Overlook where Loretta had wanted to take photos. The place was empty, and the air smelled of creosote and sun-baked sage. A gentle wind created small, dry music across the rocks. I imagined their car parked, the three of them balancing on stones, the light falling like a promise. For a moment, I allowed myself a flash of an ordinary scene. My daughter laughing at something trivial. Oscar with an almost boyish grinning concentration. Beatrice with a camera that she never quite mastered but loved to try. The flash made my throat close with both a memory and a new, sharper accusation. That something in their ordinary had been a lie. We found tire tracks on a washboard road not far from where Beatrice remembered. They were recent, the ridges crisp and the pattern of the treads still clear. Someone else had been through recently, a white SUV maybe, and it cut a path toward a narrow side canyon where the terrain became more treacherous. The tracks lifted into a place where the desert's teeth grew closer, where cell service usually thins and patience is tested. The officer took photos. I did too. Evidence is less about proving cruelty and more about keeping a record of the world as it was that day. On the way home, my phone finally lit up. A voicemail from Oscar. I didn't want to answer immediately. I feared theatrics and reheated versions of the same explanations. I played it in the motel parking lot, with Beatrice leaning against my shoulder. Oscar's voice was brisk and strained with a worry that was at once familiar and false. He said they had a flat, and he had gone to find help. He said he had asked Loretta to stay with Mom. He said he was sorry. He said they had stopped somewhere farther down the road to get service. His voice carried the texture of someone trying to sound like a man who had done everything right. In the words were the kind of measurement we both knew how to read. The lack of details, the absence of calls returned. A man who leaves his mother alone on a road for 36 hours without returning or calling is either negligent or calculating. The difference matters because one is a mistake and the other is something else altogether. Loretta back from the truck with hands that didn't want to be steady. The line rang and rang. Finally a voice, tired, thin, and oddly abstract, picked up. She said she was at a friend's place and that Oscar had texted they had an emergency. I pressed. I asked where. She said she couldn't remember, that everything had happened so fast. Her voice had the quality of someone trying to place a dream. I told her to come home and asked that she tell me everything, every small oddity. The request landed like a hand on a table. She promised. We sat the porch of my house for a long while when we got back, the afternoon sun pressing a warm palm to our shoulders. Beatrice sat with her camera in her lap and fingers that kept restlessly finding things to fix. An old picture frame, a loose seam on the cushion. I boiled water and made tea. In the quiet, the urge to explode into action was fierce. The desire to strike someone down with a rhetorical gavel had the same heat as grief. But this was not the instant for thunder. The law has patience. So must we. Do you think they're in danger? She asked finally, not looking at me. I don't know, I said honestly, but we'll find out. We'll do it right. The sentence was small. It was the only one that mattered. I was a man accustomed to building cases from pieces, and now the pieces were at my fingertips. A gas station clerk, a motel receipt, tire tracks, a voicemail that avoided specifics. The work would be slow and deliberate. It would be precise. That was the only way I knew to turn emotion into something that could breathe and stand. Later, when the evening fell and the world folded into itself, I sat at my old desk with a map and a stack of receipts and the kind of patience a life of cases gives a man. I plotted possible paths, called the officer for updates, took the time to note even minute inconsistencies. Someone had chosen to leave a woman on the roadside with bruises and cold and the look of shame. Whoever that was would not be permitted to bury the truth beneath excuses. The drive through darkness had done more than carry us across miles. It had pointed out, in the stark lights of night, the thinness of what we call a plan and the weight of what it means to make choices. As the stars came down like pins in a map, I felt the old certainty of my life stitching itself into the new task. We would find the pieces. We would ask the hard questions. We would make the map that the desert had tried to dissolve. Outside, the night kept its ancient watch, and inside, a house that had once been ordinary, prepared for the deliberate work of justice. I laid out the items we'd gathered: motel receipt, the envelope with the station address, photographs, the small, cruel record of times. I made a list for tomorrow. Follow the white truck tracks, interview the trucker, speak to anyone who had been on the Western Pass that morning. Each item was a small, steady step. Each step was an act of witness. Beatrice slept in the next room, and I listened to the softness of her breathing like a bell. I thought of my father, who had always said that the desert reveals men's true shapes, and I thought of the shape of things that were to come. Night rearranged itself into a plan. Dawn would come, and with it, the work. They say memory is a lantern you hold in a dark room. It only lights a small circle, but sometimes that circle is enough to see the thing you dropped. For the next 48 hours, my life was a series of lantern-lit circles, small facts picked up one by one, examined, then placed into a growing pattern. The pattern did not comfort me. It made my hands shake. When the first rational fog cleared, the mind goes hunting for cause. I began with the like-minded habit of prosecutors and old men. List, photograph, document. Beatrice slept fitfully that morning. She kept waking and rubbing at her temples as if sound itself hurt. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had been brewed thin and clinical, and I laid out the evidence in grids like a chemist arranging samples. Photographs, the bruise on her cheek that moved from violet to a sickly yellow between frames, the fingerprints on her upper arm captured in close-up to show the crescent shape of the grip, the motel receipt time-stamped, and the paper napkin David had kept where she'd scribbled my cell number. Paper. David's written recollection with the attendant's neat block print about when he found her, the police station's case number scrawled on the top of a page by the young desk sergeant, the travel insurance folder Oscar had produced at dinner, which now felt less like prudence and more like an excuse. Receipts. A small, cheap coffee cup from the desert stop dated the morning she'd been left. A purchase at a roadside market I had not expected. Little things that have nothing to do with love, but everything to do with proving that your life is not a fiction someone can rewrite. I tried to keep my anger at bay in those first hours. Anger is a hot wind that can scorch evidence, drive people away, make you say ruinous things. I had to be tactical. The first precise thing I did was request Beatrice's phone records. You learn to speak in requests when you've worked in an office where people have to sign subpoenas and justify every demand. The company obliged with bewildering slowness, and each minute of delay felt like a small theft. Beatrice insisted she didn't want Loretta to feel attacked. "She's my daughter," she whispered one afternoon at the sink, wrapping her hands around a mug for warmth. She must have had reasons. There was an ache in her voice that was older than fury and softer than reconciliation. I wanted to pull her into my arms and tell her she didn't have to forgive anyone she didn't want to. But there is a cruel dignity to the mother's instinct to protect even those who have hurt you. She wanted to hear Loretta's side, even as her body testified against the truth of being left. I called Loretta again and left a message that balanced tone and quiet gravity. I kept my sentences spare, the way one tries to place a bowl down without clattering. Later, after the third unanswered call, I drove to her apartment without telling Beatrice. It was less confrontation than a gesture. I needed to see the place where my daughter was now becoming someone whose absent conduct had betrayed her mother. Miss Led opened the door with the slow, guarded smile of someone who expects either commendation or accusation. Up close, she looked tired. There were small, dark crescents under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights spent scrolling. She invited me in as if she'd been expecting a visit and not entirely surprised by it. "I called," I said when we were seated with coffee that she'd insisted on making. She had the habit of stirring sugar in thin rings, a nervous little counterpoint to the words she didn't yet say. "You called?" she echoed, as if the voice on voicemail could be a different geography than the one at her door. She seemed at once careful and exhausted, like someone balancing on a ledge without wanting to look down. "B was left on the road, Loretta. She was at the desert stop. She's here now. She's hurt." I watched the light move across her face. Surprise, then concern, and then a flush of something that was harder to read. There are patterns in reaction that experience teaches you. Genuine shock rings like bell clear. Guilt is a slow burn with a peculiar tightness at the jaw. Loretta's voice was small when she answered. She said they had a blowout, that Oscar had gone for help, that she had gone with him. She said the radiator had been acting up the week before, and that they thought they would be back within an hour. She said the plan had been to get a tow, not to leave anyone behind. Her words were quick and precise. They also lacked the granular texture of someone who had lived through the things she described. Terrorism. Why didn't you answer B's calls? I asked. The question was not rhetorical. It was an instrument. The absence of an explanation is sometimes more telling than a clumsy lie. I didn't hear it, she said. My phone was. She gestured at the apartment like the gesture explained to itself. She said Oscar had taken her phone to look for a signal. We were in the canyon. There was no service. She stopped, as if the canyon swallowed the rest of the sentence. The canyon as an alibi is a common one. Terrain plays the role of collaborator when people need to be unseen. I did not press that hour, though my list of questions lengthened in the privacy of my head. Instead, I watched Loretta. She was my daughter, yes, but not a child, and the distance between love and accusation had become a chasm I had to cross with care and attention. The real change that day came not from questioning, but from chance. An old friend of mine, an investigator who'd worked with me on cases when my shoulders were narrower and my patience longer, called because he'd seen the police on the news. He offered a simple observation that made the air go thin. Check the insurance paperwork. He had a way of saying things that made the obvious seem urgent. I remembered Oscar tapping that manila folder at dinner, the way he displayed it like an announcement. A man who shows his safety net often has a reason to believe it will be needed. I asked Loretta, in a voice that tried to sound neutral, if she knew about the travel insurance. She smiled then, an odd, sharp thing. Of course. Oscar's the kind of man who likes to have everything in order. The smile didn't reach her eyes. It just felt practical, nothing more. I watched her fingers as she spoke, how they twisted the edge of a napkin, the tremor of someone holding a truth too awkward or too inconvenient to set down. When I went to Oscar's office, it felt like entering a set where the props were curated to suggest good character. He was dressed in one of those collars that try to square soft features into industry, sleeves rolled with shirt cuff precision. He greeted me with a stiff handshake and that easy, practiced worry that men who like to manage projects adopt. He said they had a problem with the car and had sought help down the road. He said he'd called several towing companies and a friend who might have been able to help. There was a naturalness to his account that might have been convincing in a less fraught world. When I asked about specifics, location, time, names, his answers were sometimes exact and sometimes oddly vague. Why leave Mom? I asked, and did not try to hide the edge in my voice. My years prosecuting taught me that every edge exposes a fact. Either the person answers honestly, or they harden, and hardness is a kind of evidence in itself. He said he had thought it would be a short delay, that they'd return. He said there was road construction in some places, and that they'd been directed by a local man to a side road. He used the word mistake, as if mistakes are the natural condition of travel. He said apologies and promised fervent concern, and he wanted to do everything he could to make it right. He seemed sincere in the way men who have rehearsed a role can seem sincere. When I asked him to let the police check his phone records, to confirm where he'd been by GPS and receipts, his face shifted minutely. It was the kind of micro-expression I'd seen in courtrooms, the tiny pivot of someone calculating the harm of transparency. He said he would, eventually. He promised cooperation. The phrase, "I'll cooperate," is the verbal foreshadowing of a later, cumbersome discovery. I left Oscar's office with a booklet of receipts he'd handed me, gas stations, a sandwich shop, a cursory tow inquiry, and with a courtesy that felt like paper armor. It was not enough. I filed what he'd given with the others and moved on to subtler work. Timeline verification. Who saw them where? What cameras might have caught their car? Was the white truck someone else had noticed on the washboard road? The one Beatrice thought she'd seen? The desert is large and noisy, but people leave traces. They are not infallible. They are not magical. Tires dig patterns into dust. Receipts mark hours. Voices stay in phones. The night before, David the attendant had saved a napkin with my number and a little note Beatrice had scribbled. He had been embarrassed to keep it, he said, and ashamed he hadn't called sooner. I went back to the gas station and sat with him on a sagging stool. He told me details. A man in a white SUV had stopped briefly the morning Beatrice was left. He said the man had looked at her and then at his companion, an odd, nodding exchange that had struck him as neutral at the time. The man in the SUV had driven off toward the pass. David's shift patterns confirmed he'd seen the vehicle go by around noon. A white SUV, a tangle of identity. We compiled a list of people who might have seen them. A trucker who frequents the pass, a couple who run a small roadside market, the woman at the overlook who rents binoculars. Each of them offered a sliver of a picture. The trucker said he'd seen a white vehicle stop with a woman stepping out and then staying near the trunk while two people walked away. The market woman remembered a family arguing softly, and then the couple leaving on foot toward a canyon before sunset. We matched these recollections against the tire tracks and found a corridor that made sense. A white SUV, a stop at a pullout, an argument, then the two people walking away while the woman remained behind near the car. The pieces were accumulating into a frame that made my stomach curdle. It was still possible these were mistakes, tragedies of poor judgment, a sequence of bad luck. But the more lantern circles I lit, the more the same shape showed at the center, a calculated choice. Crimson conversation came when I finally put the pieces on the table with Loretta. I had been careful until then, gentle, neutral, but the evidence had to have a voice. There was no malice in my tone. There was only the arithmetic of truths placed side by side. You left her, I said simply, because that is what the evidence suggested, and because the world needs plain language sometimes. She looked at me like a child surprised by thunder. We didn't mean to. It wasn't like that. What does like that mean? I asked. She stood up then and paced, hands pressed to her temples. Oscar panicked. He thought he saw a way to. She stopped and the rest of the sentence evaporated. She had skill with omissions. Her silence was a kind of testimony. He said everything would be fine. He promised to be back. I am sorry. I'm sorry this happened. I tried calling. I called for hours. Milt is a poor replacement for responsibility. A person can feel bad and still owe consequences. A person can be contrite and still have made choices that require restitution. Loretta's eyes were rimmed in red when she finally spoke plain. We thought someone would come. It was stupid. I was stupid. I thought, her voice cracked like old wood. You helped him pack an insurance folder at dinner, I said, and I didn't frame it as a trap. I framed it as an observation. Why bring that up? Why be so specific with contingency if not to anticipate the possibility of leaving someone behind? She flinched, like a hand had pinched her. Oscar's a planner. He said it was practical. He kept saying we should be protected for the trip. I didn't think. Her voice fragmented between defensiveness and panic. The family veneer was cracking, and the raw things beneath it were finally leaking light. I could see then the map of their motives. Oscar wanting to limit financial exposure with an aggressive insurance plan. Loretta, willing to follow him because she trusted his calculations. A pressure to accomplish something efficient enough to be prided over. At the center was a woman who had been rendered small and waiting. That night, alone at my desk, I composed an email to the detective on our case. The letter was clinical, a selection of times, quotes, and witness statements. I attached photographs and receipts and a short narrative summary. There is a curious comfort in documents when your chest is an aching drum. The paper keeps order. The night keeps company. Beatrice watched me assemble the evidence with a mix of detachment and relief. I don't want them to hurt again because of this, she said one evening, voice wobbly. Not because I think they are bad people, but because I can't bear that level of carelessness again. There was forgiveness threaded with iron. It was confusing and humane. I respected it without letting it cloud course. The law is not always about punishment alone. It is also about keeping others safe. The detective called back faster than I expected. A small victory. A security camera at a gas station 20 miles back had a grainy shot of a white SUV. The timestamp did not lie. The image showed Oscar's car, rear bumper visible, rolling past a frame where a man in a hat lingered by a truck. It was dirt and light and not a confession, but it was a place to stand. We had one concrete sighting on the record: trafficking. That night we sat at the kitchen table and I told Beatrice the news. "We have a sighting," I said. "A camera caught the white SUV. We have a trucker who saw them stop, and 2 people walk away. There are receipts. We have David's napkin." She nodded as if each piece relieved a small weight. "Do you want me to confront them?" I asked, and the question was more than procedural. The line between father and prosecutor had started to blur in my chest. I could be both. I could be patient, and I could move like a man who has known how to take the long course. "No," she said, "not yet. Let the detective do his thing. I don't want a scene." Her voice was steady, but I heard the fatigue in it like the sound of old rope being tugged. We both wanted the same thing: the truth. We both wanted consequences that matched the harm. We both wanted to preserve whatever remained of the family's fragile architecture. So we waited with the slow cruelty of people who must trust systems that move in their own time. Waiting is an industry all its own, full of small humiliations. You keep answering your phone as if time is a neighbor who might ring with good news. You file paperwork and sign forms and sleep in fits. You keep the evidence organized like a shrine. In the middle of one long night, I woke to find Beatrice in the kitchen making tea. She had on one of my old sweaters and her hair tied back. The bruise had narrowed to a bruised shadow. She looked less like a victim and more like a person who had been cataloged and then reclaimed. She handed me a mug, and I saw the small, steady armor of someone learning how to carry herself through a world that had been less kind than we'd believed. "We will find their reasons," she said quietly. "Not to excuse them, but to know why people we love have the capacity to hurt us." Her voice held a sadness that felt like a map of all the women who had survived small betrayals. There are days when the human heart chooses grief, and others when it chooses action. We had chosen both. The case file on my desk thickened with photocopies and witness statements. The detective's calls became more regular, and the camera images clearer by increments. The lantern of memory had lit enough of the darkroom to show not a single perpetrator, but a pattern, a plan disguised as prudence, a family's ordinary life faceted into something that would have to be dismantled and examined in light. The work of bringing the pieces into the light would take patience and care. It would also require exactness, the kind that makes enemies of assumptions. Love is not an alibi, and familial affection should never be a shield for neglect. When betrayal comes in the close of normalcy, the most grievous wound is not the bruise on the skin, but the erosion of trust. The desert had taken a piece of that trust and left us with the bones of a question. At the edge of the list, I kept a small notation. "Remember to ask the insurance company for claim activity." It seemed almost petty next to a hurt human body, but paper is how the world often speaks when people try to hide. Insurance is an arithmetic of motive. Motive is the axis upon which justice turns. I slept badly that night, knowing how many small markers we still needed to collect, but with a quiet, stubborn conviction that the truth, methodically shown, becomes impossible to ignore. Tangled arrived thin and clever. The detective had lined up a meeting with a tow operator who'd been called that day, and the white SUV's GPS ping had placed it near an overlook at noon. The dots on the map connected with a finger that made a slow, accusatory line. I felt the shape of the next steps: interviews, formal statements, subpoenas when necessary. It was the labor my life had trained me for, the slow, careful flipping of stones to see what wriggled beneath. When I told Beatrice the news that afternoon, she let out a small breath that carried a weight. It wasn't relief so much as permission. Permission to keep going. Permission to name what was broken and to demand it be put back together. We were not naive. We knew the law is an imperfect instrument. But injustice, we also knew, leaves a trail if you look hard enough. That night we sat at the table with the lamp on and the map spread out between us. The desert lines on paper looked different from the desert in life. Tidy, crosshatched, conquerable. I traced the route with my finger and felt a curious calm. Procedures, evidence, words. They are the tools you use when the heart is raw. They are also, sometimes, the very bridge to healing. We would be cautious, but we would not be passive. We would let the detective walk the legal paths, and I would do what prosecutors do. Collect, question, present. The family would be tested. It would either fracture and become shadow, or it would be forced to reveal its seams and be mended with the stubbornness of truth. At the center of the night, Beatrice placed her hand over mine. It was small and warm, a pulse I'd held for 41 years. "We'll do it right," she said. "We will," I answered. And for the first time in days, there was a sense that the word "we" contained something more than loss. It contained action, and the slow, relentless making of accountability from the fragments of betrayal. The heater hummed low as the miles disappeared behind us, desert wind whispering against the car windows. Beatrice sat hunched in the passenger seat, clutching the blanket tighter around her shoulders. I kept glancing sideways, afraid she might vanish if I looked away for too long. The bruises on her arms stood out even in the dim dashboard light. Ugly, finger-shaped truths that no one could deny. Memberg, neither of us spoke. The silence was thick, filled with the unasked questions pressing against my throat. When she finally did speak, her voice was soft, almost a ghost of itself. "They were fighting," she said suddenly, "Loretta and Oscar, before it happened." Slashing my grip annoyed my grip on the steering wheel. "Fighting about what?" "Strife, money," she whispered. "He said they were running out of it, that the trip was already too expensive, and she said it didn't matter because soon everything would be fine." I didn't understand what she meant. My pulse quickened. "Did he ever hurt her? Raise a hand?" Beatrice shook her head weakly. "No, not then. But his temper, Ivory, it was different this time. The way he looked at me, like I was in the way." Childbirth, her eyes glazed over as she stared out at the black horizon. When the car stopped in the middle of nowhere, he told me to wait inside. Loretta said they'd walk a little up the road to find a signal. I watched them disappear into the dust. I waited, 10 minutes, then 30, then an hour. Her voice cracked on the next words. When I finally got out, the road was empty, just wind and the sun burning down. I thought they must have gone for help, but when the sun started to fall, I knew. I felt something cold crawl up my spine. Every instinct honed from decades in court told me this was no mistake. "They planned it," I said quietly. She didn't answer right away. Her fingers trembled on the blanket. "Before we left, Oscar kept asking about your retirement account, about the insurance. I didn't think much of it. I just thought he was being responsible." She turned to me then, eyes wide with shame and disbelief. "Ivory, our own daughter. She stood there while he told me to get out of the car. She didn't stop him." I couldn't speak. My chest ached as though the air itself had turned heavy. The Beatrice I knew, who'd bake birthday cakes for everyone in the office, who prayed for strangers she'd never meet, was sitting beside me, unraveling from the inside. "I kept hoping," she said after a moment. "Even after night fell, I thought maybe they'd gotten lost. Maybe they'd come back with help. I sat on that bench and watched every pair of headlights thinking it was them. Every single one." She bit her lip until it bled. "And when David came out with that blanket, I almost told him not to call you. I didn't want you to see me like this." That broke me. I reached over and took her hand, cold, fragile, shaking. You did nothing wrong, Beatrice. Nothing. Whatever they thought they could do, whatever they wanted, they'll answer for it. Shimmer her face away, tears streaking through the dirt on her cheeks. I just don't understand why, Ivory. Why would our daughter do this? The car rolled through the empty highway, the desert swallowing sound and light, leaving only the hum of the tires and her quiet sobs. I didn't have an answer yet, but I would find one. Somewhere between the flickering motel sign on the horizon and the silent, starless sky above, I made a promise I'd kept all my life as a prosecutor. Never let the guilty sleep easy. This time, the case wasn't for the court. It was for Beatrice. For the 41 years she'd stood by me. For the woman who believed love could never betray her. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure the law would be enough. The Desert Rose Motel looked like something forgotten by time. Sun-bleached paint, a flickering neon sign that buzzed faintly against the night, and the kind of silence that felt alive. I parked under a sputtering streetlight and shut off the engine. Beatrice hadn't said a word for the last 20 minutes. She sat still, the blanket clutched tight, eyes half open but somewhere far away. "I'll get the key," I said quietly. She nodded without looking at me. Insensitive, the night clerk barely looked up from his phone. A faded map of Nevada hung behind him, curling at the corners. I asked for a single room, paid in cash, and signed the register with a name that wasn't mine. Old habits die hard. Sickness. When I returned, Beatrice was still staring through the windshield. "Come on, sweetheart," I whispered. "Let's get you inside." The room smelled faintly of bleach and old cigarettes. A single yellow bulb buzzed overhead. I helped her sit on the edge of the bed, then fetched a damp towel from the sink and began cleaning the dirt from her face. The bruises looked worse under the light. Violet shadows across her cheek, thumbprints on her arms. She winced when I touched her, but didn't pull away. "Do you need a doctor?" I asked. Shook her head. "No hospitals. Please, Ivory, not yet." I didn't press her. Instead, I set the towel aside and took out my phone. I started documenting every bruise, every mark, every angle. Photos for evidence, the kind that could speak louder than any courtroom statement. But this time, I wasn't building a case for trial. I was preparing for war. On the dresser sat a small notepad. I flipped it open and began writing. Persistence. A, motive, opportunity. Turbulence. The three pillars of every crime. Day 1. Family dinner. Oscar presents insurance documents. Beatrice's wine glass constantly refilled. Shameful. Departure for Death Valley. Oscar drives. Loretta texts once from the road. All good so far. Relinquent. Beatrice abandoned near Batty. The timeline was too clean, too deliberate. No random breakdown, no accident. I could see Oscar's smug face across the dinner table, that rehearsed charm, the kind of man who smiled while calculating your worth. I'd seen his type 1,000 times in the courtroom. Greedy, manipulative, and absolutely convinced they'd get away with it. Sweetness stirred behind me. "What are you writing?" Shuffled. "Facts," I said. "Evidence." She gave a small, hollow laugh. "You're still the prosecutor, even now." Until to her, "That's all I know how to be." Remove for a moment. "Don't go after them, Ivory, please. You don't know what they've done." That stopped me cold. "What do you mean, I don't know?" She hesitated, biting her lip. "The night before we left, I overheard them. They weren't talking about just money. They mentioned policies and signatures." I frowned. "Insurance fraud?" Silenced sheep. Slowly. "I think they wanted to make it look like an accident, like I died out there." Words hit harder than I expected. The idea of my own daughter, my Loretta, plotting her mother's death turned my stomach. "And they would have gotten the payout." Slamming, she whispered. "Oscar said it was the only way to fix everything. Loretta said she couldn't live with the debt anymore." Iced at her, heart pounding. "Debt?" Beatrice's voice trembled. "They lost money in some investment, something with his company. They never told us. They thought, if I was gone, the insurance would cover it." Silence. Only the buzz of the light filled the room. My mind began to spin the web tighter, faster. Dates, conversations, motives aligning perfectly. I knew what this was now. A financial murder, disguised as abandonment. Only it failed because Beatrice refused to die. I crossed to the nightstand, poured 2 glasses of water, and handed her one. You rest, I'll handle the rest. She looked at me with fear in her eyes. What are you going to do? Abolish, I met her gaze. What I should have done a long time ago. Find them and make them answer. Outside, the wind howled across the motel parking lot, kicking up dust and whispers. Somewhere in that emptiness, my daughter and her husband were sleeping soundly, thinking they'd erased their past. They had no idea the desert had given their secret back to me. The desert keeps its own hours. It opens and closes like a slow, patient book. Morning arrived pale and honest, and I left the motel with a thermos of coffee and a pocket full of scribbled names. The map on my lap looked less like a promise and more like a plan. Follow the white SUV, talk to the trucker, check the overlook, find witnesses. The list steadied me. The work always did. Disra tracks are honest things. They don't lie about weight or speed, and they betray the length of a trip where memory blurs. We found the tracks where the road dropped into an arroyo, a pattern of tread in the dirt that matched the grainy image from the gas station camera. The tracks led away from the main road and toward a narrow wash where the land closed in like a jaw. Whoever had driven that way had wanted distance. A trucker named Roy was the first person to put a face to those tracks. He ran a rig that had seen too many winters and knew the past like the lines on his hands. His voice was gravel and smoke. He remembered the white SUV because it had pulled in at a weird hour, and the driver had been jumpy, scanning the horizon as if waiting for something he didn't want to see. Roy said he'd watched 2 people walk away from the vehicle toward a shallow canyon, while a woman stayed behind near the trunk, cradling something small against her chest. He thought it was a fight or a family dispute, something personal. Who would imagine it was premeditated? Roy's description fit the lantern-lit outline I'd been building. A family, a staged delay. Someone left. He pointed to a sidetrack with a cigarette-stained finger. They headed that way, he said. But there's a saddle up ahead where a lot of folks stop. People get lost up there sometimes. Folks break down. Folks disappear. He shrugged like it was a natural property of the place. To him, the desert was a geography of both mercy and menace. I followed the sidetrack until the SUV's path petered out near scrub and rock. There were more prints in the ground, boot marks, the scuff of someone dragging something, a fabric scrap caught on a creosote bush. I bagged the scrap in a sandwich bag from my truck like an evidence tech, though I'm nothing official now. It was the kind of ragged cloth that might have come from a sweater or a skirt, stained with a pale brown line. It was a small, ugly thing that tasted like proof. The canyon opened into a shallow basin where sunlight threw the bones of the earth into relief. It felt like a place that had watched many human dramas and judged each one with the same unblinking face. There was a small cairn of rocks someone had disturbed, fresh stones out of place. Nearby, a discarded coffee cup lay in the dust, the same cheap brand listed on one of Oscar's receipts. The little coincidences made my gut twist. The receipts had placed them in town. The tracks had led here. It was a braided path of intent. I called the detective and left a terse update. He said he'd dispatch a unit to canvass the area and that he'd ask for a more thorough sweep. I felt the old frustration with human systems, their slowness, then pushed it back like a muscle I'd learned to control. There was a rhythm to investigations, and impatience often ruined things. So I moved methodically. Photos, notes, matching treads. On the second day, I found the white SUV. It was half hidden behind a stand of mesquite off a back road, the paint dulled with dust. Someone had abandoned it in haste. The rear hatch was slightly ajar, and there were crumbs on the floor. I walked around it like a juror at a scene. A child's sunglasses lay on the dash, and tucked under the passenger seat was a small insurance brochure, one I recognized from the folder at dinner. Whoever had driven this wanted distance, but they'd left the paper behind, as if hurriedness made them careless. Inside the glove compartment, I found a receipt from a small auto parts store, dated the morning after the dinner, and with a phone number scribed in the margin. The handwriting matched Oscar's, I thought, not because I'd seen it formally, but because arrogance has patterns. Men who keep things neat rarely scribble like that unless they mean to. I pocketed the receipt and took a photograph. Each little omission they'd made was a gift. When I drove the SUV back toward town, an action I justified to myself as necessary for safekeeping, I felt the thin line between investigation and trespass. The law has reasons for forms and warrants, and I respected that. But the desert had already been generous with truths, and some proofs needed quick hands. The detective got the call and later took custody of the vehicle with a polite, distracted professionalism that hid the gravity of what it meant. What came next were the small human things that make cases real. A man at the parts store remembered Oscar because he'd bought radiator coolant and a cheap toolkit and had been impatient about paying. The tow operator who'd been called earlier, before Oscar's later tow inquiry, remembered the voice on the phone as hurried and thin-skinned. Each person's recollection was a tiny light that filled in the shape of the day. At night, I drive out to the overlooks alone. The horizon was a slow, indifferent judge, and in its quiet, I felt the strain of the days like a bruise. I thought about the girl who sat with her hands folded like a prayer at the gas station, the way she'd kept her small overnight bag, the way she'd trusted a stranger before her own blood. There are moments where human decency and human calculation sit in the same room and glare at each other. This was one of them. Toward the end of the week, the detective called with news small and enormous. A GPS ping from a rental phone placed Oscar near a service road at a particular hour that contradicted his earlier story. It was not a confession, it was a cornered fact. He also told me the insurance company had flagged an online inquiry about accelerated policies that Oscar had set up 2 weeks before the trip. Motive is rarely a single thing. It is a braided set of desires and pressures, and now the braid had a recognizable pattern. Negligence to the kind of direct pressure that rearranges facts into confessions, interviews under the steady light of official offices, the kind that strip theater from stories. Oscar's jaw tightened when questioned about the GPS and the timing. Loretta cried and used the word stupid as a litany, repeated until it lost sense and gained meaning. They tried the plea of misunderstanding, an accident compounded by fear, but their words landed thin against the stack of paper that said otherwise. One evening, long after they'd been brought in for a formal interview and allowed to go on bail, I drove out to the wash again. The sky was a slab of bruised color. I sat in the truck and held the fabric scrap I'd found, pressing it between my fingers until it softened. It was only cloth, and yet it carried the weight of evidence and the smell of the day they thought they'd hidden. Theft had given us tracks, a half-hidden vehicle, a receipt, and a ping of a phone. It had not given motive neatly, but it had given enough to make the question unavoidable. Why would people you loved leave a woman alone to wait in the cold? The answer hovered like the heat above the road, greed and fear braided into choice. I drove home ready to help the detective finish the mapping and to prepare the paper trail that would make the court listen. Tracks in the sand are temporary, but records are more stubborn. They don't blow away with the wind. Then, as the lights of town rose in a small, comforting scatter, I felt a hard little peace settle over me. We had a path. We would walk it until it ended in truth. They brought them in on a Tuesday when the sky was a hard, stainless blue. No theatrics, no storm to hide motives. The detective met me at the station with a thin smile that meant a lot had been set into motion. Files, timestamps, camera stills, the scrap of cloth and the receipts, small, stubborn things, had braided into a case that the law could carry. It's an odd sensation to see family names typed into a criminal complaint. Intimate letters made official, the private turned public by ink and insistence. Tightened, at their bright interview room, the bright interview room than she had in my living room. The youth in her face was gone like a candle burned too long at one side. What remained was taut worry. Oscar tried to keep his expression even, but the judge's gavel of evidence had a way of cracking him open. The detective led the interview with a calm that had learned to carry other people's storms. He moved from fact to fact, making the mundane arithmetic of the day look like a sequence of choices rather than miseries. They had rehearsed stories, flat practiced lines about confusion, an overheating radiator, the hope of a quick tow. Under the light, the stories bent. The GPS pings didn't forget. Witness descriptions did not evaporate. The insurance inquiries were a quiet, incriminating ledger. Under the kind of questioning that is less about accusation and more about the patient turning of pages, the shape of their plan lost its smooth veneer. LaFace crumpled first. She said the word stupid again and then stopped. The detective didn't need theatrics. He had patience. When she told the truth, it came out like a slow confession. How Oscar had been panicked about money, how they'd discussed drastic measures, how the idea had been whispered in the clattering of late-night worry and then rationalized into a plan. She kept looking at her hands, as if the dirt there did not belong to her. Oscar's voice cracked when he finally spoke. He'd imagined insurance premiums and payouts like a ledger that could sternly correct a life. He'd not imagined the human cost. The look on my wife's face when he closed the car door, the bruise that would bloom into proof, the town's small judiciary that would not be conned by tidy lies. His words were not an apology so much as an admission coated with surprise that the world would hold him accountable. Men like him often believe practical cunning shields them from consequence. I watched the illusion slide like paint. Charges were filed, abandonment, negligence, and, because the threat of motive could not be ignored, fraudulent intent tied to the insurance inquiry. The prosecutor the detective consulted said the evidence wasn't theatrical, but it was solid. Records, witness statements, and a pattern of choices. The law moved not with the righteous speed of revenge, but with a steady, deliberate precision that felt almost surgical. It was the way truth gains weight, not in explosions, but in accumulation. The first court hearing was a public thing, small cameras, murmured crowds, the kind of exposure that strips intimacy into headlines. I sat beside Beatrice and watched her hold a tissue like a rosary. She wore a cardigan that hid the bruise but not the line of her dignity. She listened as our daughter and son-in-law stood to be arraigned. Their faces were raw in a way that made my chest ache and the hard parts of me soften. Justice can look merciless and merciful at once. What surprised me most was how the town reacted. People who had seen the family at barbecues and on church lawns spoke in court like witnesses to character and to its erosion. Some were angry manifestly. Some were hushed with sorrow that a small community's fabric had been pulled at the seams. A neighbor brought over a plate of cookies for Beatrice after the hearing, a small, human ordinance that felt like repair. Institutions would do the legal work, but neighbors do the quiet mending. The trial that followed was a slow, meticulous thing. Evidence was laid out like maps. Photographs were examined with a kind of reverent cruelty. The defense tried to paint the abandonment as a tragic mistake, a misjudgment amplified by fear. The prosecution, steady, unflashy, moved through receipts and GPS coordinates and witness testimony until the story no longer fit the characters' revised versions of themselves. In the end, the jury did what the evidence asked of them. The verdict read not only the law, but the common sense of decency. Guilty on several counts that matched the weight of harm. Sentencing tempered the retribution with a legal hand, custody and fines and mandated restorative measures. But the court's judgment did more than punish. It made a public accounting. It insisted that small cruelties cannot be hidden inside the folds of family duties. After the verdict, people said things that surprised me. Loretta wept openly, not just with shame, but with the ache of someone learning the long shape of consequences. Oscar's expression had a warble of regret that sounded like a man reading a ledger of himself for the first time. They were sentenced not only to legal penalties, but to the slow work of rebuilding what they'd broken. Community interactions, financial restitution where possible, counseling, monitored access. I didn't revel in it. Justice is not a sport. It is a process of repair, of making sure the broken understand what was broken and why. Beatrice, for her part, moved through the days like someone gathering herself from the ground. She went to court when she could. She slept more when she couldn't. She let friends and strangers bring casseroles and conversation. The bruise faded over months into a pale remnant like a weathered map. What didn't fade was her steadiness, how she met people in the grocery line with the same uncanny capacity for kindness she'd always had. It made the small victories matter more. The return of morning routines, the slow reconnection to meals cooked well, the small pleasure of the front porch chair at dusk. Forearm. Once, late in autumn when the desert cooled, Beatrice and I drove back to the overlook where Loretta had wanted her photo. We sat quietly while the wind smoothed the bones of the earth. "Why do people do such things?" she asked, not in anger but in that searching voice that had always been hers. I didn't have an answer that made comfort. I had a reasoned one. Fear, greed, the human capacity to rationalize harm under the loudspeaker of necessity. None of that relieved their responsibility. "I miss the easy trust," she said finally, and the sentence landed with its own kind of grief. "So do I said, "but trust is something we can choose again, in small steps." We watched the sun fold into the distance, the day giving its last clear color. Justice had been served in one register. The harder work, the remaking of ourselves and our family, would be quieter and longer. In the months that followed, we rebuilt a life that was smaller in some ways and truer in others. Letters were written not for courts but for hearts. Loretta sent a note from a rehabilitation program, awkward, halting, full of the kind of apologies people make when they begin to understand the shape of their wrongs. She asked to come home someday, when she had learned to be someone who would not leave an old woman to the desert. I kept the letter on my desk like a growing thing. Terminated. The desert had been a cruel teacher. It had shown how little separates love from neglect when people choose the path of ease. But it had also given us evidence, tiny truths that, when assembled, became a justice hard to deny. In the end, that was what comforted me most. The idea that the world, if you work at it enough, will sometimes answer for what was done. I learned again what I have always known and have taught others in courtrooms and kitchens alike. Accountability is not merely punishment. It is a way to require that people who break the terms of trust look at what they broke and, if possible, attempt to put it back together. The law had done its measured work. The rest, mending family, rebuilding trust, would be our labor, patient as the desert and stubborn as the mesquite that roots itself in barren places. Patience. Sentenced and I sat on the porch that evening and watched the sky turn a color we both knew well. She squeezed my hand and said simply, "We kept each other." The words were small and enough. The desert had returned what it could: truth, consequence, and the possibility, slow and fragile, of forgiveness.